Japanese prisoners thought the Americans would torture and starve them. But when Japanese prisoners stepped into Camp McCoy in 1944, the enemy greeted them not with violence, but with hamburgers and Coca-Cola. In the spring of 1943, a young Japanese soldier named Corporal Tanaka found himself on the deck of an American transport ship, hands bound, head bowed, waiting for death. He'd been captured on Guadalcanal after weeks of starvation and disease had reduced his unit to skeletal shadows. The propaganda ministers back in Tokyo had been clear. Capture meant dishonor worse than death itself. American devils would torture him, mutilate him, parade his body as a trophy. He had seen the leaflets, heard the radio broadcasts, absorbed the lessons of Bushido that demanded he take his own life rather than face such humiliation. But when the Americans found him unconscious in a foxhole, they had not killed him. They'd given him water. And now, as the ship cut through Pacific waves toward an unknown shore, Tanaka prepared himself for the brutality that surely awaited him on American soil. What he could not have prepared for was a hamburger. The story of Japanese prisoners of war in American camps during World War II is not typically told through the lens of food. We remember the great battles, the atomic bombs, the surrender ceremonies aboard battleships. We recall the strategic bombing campaigns, the island-hopping operations, the names that echo through history like thunder: Midway, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. But beneath the grand narrative of empire and conflict lies a quieter story, one told in the language of daily life, of small moments that slowly accumulated into something profound. It is a story about men who crossed an ocean expecting devils and found instead a civilization they could not comprehend. It is a story about how a simple carbonated beverage and a sandwich made of ground beef became symbols of everything these soldiers had been taught to despise, and how those same symbols gradually revealed cracks in the mythology that had sent them to war. When the first Japanese prisoners arrived at camps on the American mainland in late 1942 and early 1943, they stepped into a world that contradicted everything they thought they knew. Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Camp Tule Lake in California, Camp Lordsburg in New Mexico, Camp Kennedy in Texas. These places became home to approximately 5,000 to 6,000 Japanese military prisoners over the course of the war, a remarkably small number compared to the hundreds of thousands of German and Italian POWs who would also find themselves behind American barbed wire. The Japanese fought differently than their European counterparts. Surrender was not merely taboo, it was a violation of the deepest codes that govern their existence. To be taken alive was to become a non-person, erased from family registers, mourned as dead by loved ones who would never know the truth. And yet here they were, stepping off trains into the desert heat or the Wisconsin cold, eyes scanning the horizon for the torture chambers they had been promised. What they found instead was order, cleanliness, an almost disturbing quietness. The American guards did not scream, they did not strike. They carried clipboards and spoke in measured tones, directing the new arrivals toward barracks that, while certainly confining, bore little resemblance to the hellscapes of their imagination. The buildings were sturdy, equipped with real beds and blankets. There were latrines that functioned, showers with running water. The compounds were organized with an efficiency that seemed almost sterile in its precision. But nothing prepared them for the food. In the hierarchy of human needs, sustenance occupies a space both primal and symbolic. What we eat, how we eat, who we eat with, these details encode messages about identity, values, and power. For Japanese soldiers who had spent months subsisting on handfuls of rice, sometimes mixed with grass or bark, the sight of an American mess hall was overwhelming. Tables laden with food, real food, quantities that seemed impossible, even wasteful. Bread in thick slices, potatoes prepared in ways they had never imagined, meat, actual meat, served not as a rare luxury, but as a daily expectation. And then there was the hamburger. To understand what this meant to these men, one must first understand what they had left behind. Imperial Japan in the 1930s and 40s existed under a system of rigid social hierarchy and increasing scarcity. By the time war engulfed the Pacific, civilian populations faced severe rationing. Protein was precious. Rice, the staple that had sustained Japanese civilization for millennia, became subject to strict government control. Meat was an aristocratic privilege, consumed sparingly even by those who could afford it. The military diet, while supposedly prioritized, often consisted of rice and pickled vegetables, occasionally supplemented with fish or canned goods when supply lines permitted. Soldiers stationed in the Pacific often faced far worse. Their rations depleted by submarines and distance, reduced to survival measures that would have seemed incomprehensible to their commanders back at home. For many of these men, meat had been a New Year's delicacy, a wedding feast luxury, something reserved for the most significant occasions in life. A farmer's son from rural Kyushu might have tasted beef once or twice in his entire childhood. A factory worker from Osaka might have known meat only as tiny slivers in a communal soup pot, stretched to feed an entire family. The concept of meat as an everyday food, as something one could expect to encounter at every meal, existed outside their frame of reference entirely. It belonged to the realm of aristocracy, of wealth so profound that it seemed almost mythical.
The first encounters were marked by suspicion. Men who had been taught that Americans were barbarians, that their food was poison designed to weaken Japanese resolve, approached the mess hall offerings with understandable caution. Some refused to eat entirely at first, convinced that the abundance was a trick, a final humiliation before the torture began. Others ate mechanically, joylessly, unable to process the cognitive dissonance between the propaganda they had internalized and the reality before them. The food was not drugged. The guards were not laughing at secret plans for their demise. The hamburgers were simply hamburgers, prepared by military cooks, who had been given clear instructions under the Geneva Convention guidelines that the United States, unlike its Axis enemies, intended to honor. This adherence to international law was not purely humanitarian. The U.S. War Department understood that the treatment of prisoners served multiple strategic purposes. Well-treated POWs were more likely to provide useful intelligence. More importantly, news of humane conditions could encourage other Japanese soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death, potentially saving American lives. And in the broader propaganda war, the United States sought to position itself as the guardian of civilization against the barbarism of fascism. Photographs of well-fed, relatively comfortable prisoners served as powerful counterpoints to emerging stories about Japanese atrocities in occupied territories and the brutal treatment of Allied POWs in Japanese camps. But theory is one thing, daily reality is another. And it was in the daily reality of meals, of routines, of small kindnesses that something unexpected began to happen. Enter Coca-Cola. If the hamburger was American abundance made edible, Coca-Cola was American modernity made liquid. The syrupy brown beverage, invented in Atlanta in the 1880s and transformed into a global commercial empire, represented everything about capitalism and consumer culture that Imperial Japan's militarist government claimed to despise. It served no nutritional purpose. It existed purely for pleasure, for the sensation of sweetness and carbonation, for the psychological lift of caffeine and sugar. It was frivolous. It was decadent. It was, in the eyes of Japanese military philosophy, weak. And the prisoners loved it. Not immediately, of course. The first taste of Coca-Cola provoked reactions ranging from confusion to disgust. Japanese soldiers were accustomed to tea, to sake, to water. Carbonation was not part of their cultural vocabulary. The intense sweetness overwhelmed palates trained to appreciate subtle flavors, the delicate interplay of umami and salt that characterized Japanese cuisine. Some described it as medicine, others as syrup gone wrong. The fizzing sensation felt alien, almost aggressive, attacking the tongue and throat with its effervescence. But Coca-Cola, like America itself, had a way of growing on people. The guards drank it constantly, those distinctive contoured bottles appearing at every meal, during work breaks, in the evenings when off duty. They seemed to consume it thoughtlessly, casually, as if unlimited access to such sweetness was the most natural thing in the world. For the prisoners, watching this casual consumption, a realization slowly dawned. This was normal here. This abundance, this waste, this thoughtless plenty, this was simply how Americans lived. The psychological impact of this discovery cannot be overstated. These men had been raised in a culture of scarcity elevated to virtue. They had been taught that sacrifice was noble, that doing without built character, that Japan's spiritual purity would overcome America's material weakness. The whole premise of the war, as sold to the Japanese public, rested on the idea that Americans were soft, pampered, unable to endure hardship. They would crumble when faced with Japanese discipline and fighting spirit.
But here, in these camps scattered across the American interior, the evidence suggested a different story. The Americans were not soft, despite their abundance. They were strong because of it. Their soldiers were well-fed, well-equipped, seemingly supplied from some bottomless well of industrial production, and they could afford to extend that bounty even to their enemies. When a Japanese POW received a Coca-Cola, whether as part of a ration or a reward for work, he held in his hands proof that the propaganda had lied. America was not weak. It was not on the verge of collapse. It was, instead, so powerful that it could feed and refresh even those who had tried to kill its sons. The camps themselves became laboratories of cultural collision. The U.S. military, recognizing the unique challenges posed by Japanese prisoners, developed what they called reorientation programs. These efforts sought to gradually expose POWs to American values, to democratic ideas, to alternative narratives about the war and its causes. Food played a central role in these efforts, though not always consciously. A man whose stomach is full thinks differently than a man who is starving. A prisoner who receives ice cream on a hot day begins to question whether his captors are truly the demons he was promised. Ice cream, in particular, became a source of wonder and bewilderment. Many Japanese prisoners had never encountered it before. The concept of frozen milk, sweetened and flavored, served purely for pleasure, seemed to encapsulate American excess in frozen form. On summer days in Texas or New Mexico, when the heat made the barracks unbearable, prisoners would line up to receive small cups of vanilla or chocolate ice cream, their faces registering astonishment at the cold sweetness melting on their tongues. Some guards reported seeing prisoners save their ice cream, trying to hoard it, not yet understanding that more would come tomorrow, that this was not a rare treasure to be preserved, but a casual treat offered again and again. The daily routine in these camps followed patterns designed to maintain order while providing opportunities for labor and recreation. The Geneva Convention stipulated that prisoners could be required to work, and most Japanese POWs were assigned tasks ranging from agricultural labor to maintenance duties. They harvested crops, built roads, maintained camp facilities. They were paid small amounts, script that could be used in camp canteens to purchase items like cigarettes, toiletries, and snacks, including Coca-Cola. The fact that prisoners could buy Coca-Cola with their own earnings added another layer to the experience. They were not merely passive recipients of American largesse. They were, in some limited sense, participants in the consumer economy that defined American life. This participation, however constrained, began to reshape how some prisoners understood themselves and their situation. In Japan, individual desire was subordinated to collective duty. Personal preferences were less important than fulfilling one's role in the social hierarchy. But in the camp canteen, a man could choose chocolate or gum, Coca-Cola or cigarettes. The choices were trivial, certainly, but the act of choosing was not. It represented a tiny exercise of individual agency, a small rebellion against the total subjugation of self that Japanese military culture demanded. Not all prisoners experienced this psychological shift, of course. Some remained committed to their original ideology, viewing cooperation with their captors as betrayal. These hardliners often formed factions within the camps, attempting to maintain military discipline and Japanese cultural practices in defiance of their circumstances.
They conducted secret ceremonies on Japanese holidays, maintained ranks and hierarchies from their original units, and sometimes violently enforced codes of conduct among their fellow prisoners. For these men, accepting American food, enjoying Coca-Cola, adapting to camp life, these were not pragmatic adjustments, but profound moral failures. The tension between hardliners and those willing to adapt created its own drama within the camps. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, there were reports of prisoners being beaten by their fellows for showing too much friendliness toward guards. At Camp Kennedy in Texas, a prisoner who had participated enthusiastically in English language classes was found dead one morning, an apparent suicide that some suspected was murder. The code of Bushido did not dissolve simply because men found themselves behind barbed wire. For many, the shame of capture intensified their commitment to traditional values, as if maintaining perfect discipline in captivity could somehow redeem the dishonor of survival. Yet even among the hardliners, small cracks appeared. A man might publicly denounce American decadence while privately savoring the taste of a hamburger. Another might participate in required educational programs with visible contempt, then later be found reading the American magazines provided in the camp library. The human capacity for cognitive dissonance is remarkable, but it has limits. Daily evidence that contradicts one's beliefs, repeated over months and years, gradually erodes certainty. And the evidence here was not abstract or theoretical. It was concrete, tangible, edible. By 1944, the tide had clearly turned. American submarines had devastated Japanese supply lines. The island-hopping campaign was pushing inexorably toward the home islands. Allied bombing raids were reducing Japanese cities to ash. And in the camps, the prisoners heard about it all, through official news releases, through conversations with guards, through the very fact that more prisoners were arriving with each passing month. Men captured in the Marianas and the Philippines, each bringing fresh stories of defeat and destruction. And still the hamburgers came. Still the Coca-Cola flowed. There was something almost obscene about it, this abundance in the midst of global carnage. While Japanese civilians starved under American blockade, their soldiers in American custody gained weight. While Tokyo burned, prisoners in Texas played baseball. The juxtaposition was not lost on the men living it. Some felt guilt, a gnawing sense that they were betraying their comrades still fighting by accepting these comforts. Others felt relief mixed with shame. A few began to feel something more dangerous, doubt about the system that had sent them to war in the first place. The American guards, for their part, had been instructed to maintain professional distance while adhering to humane standards. But regulations could not entirely prevent human connection. Shared cigarettes, laughter over a botched attempt at English or Japanese, a guard showing photographs of his family back home. Small moments of recognition that underneath the uniforms and the ideologies, men were just men. Some guards brought extra candy or magazines from town. Others helped prisoners send letters to families in Japan, navigating the complex censorship requirements. These interactions, minor as they might have seemed, chipped away at the careful dehumanization that war requires. Baseball became a particularly important bridge. The sport, ironically, had been introduced to Japan by Americans in the late 19th century and had become wildly popular. Japanese POWs organized teams within the camps, playing against each other and occasionally against American Guard units. The diamond became neutral territory, where a competition could be friendly, where a well-hit ball earned respect regardless of which uniform the batter wore. After games, both sides might share Coca-Colas, the bottles sweating condensation in the heat, and for those brief moments, the war seemed very far away. One guard at Camp McCoy, a young man from Iowa named Private Miller, later recalled in an interview how strange it felt to sit on the bleachers with Japanese prisoners after a game, passing around bottles of Coke and trying to communicate through gestures in broken language. He had lost a brother at Pearl Harbor. Every instinct told him to hate these men. But watching them laugh at a dropped fly ball, seeing them argue passionately about a close call at home plate, he could not maintain the hatred. They were just guys who liked baseball. guys who missed their homes, guys who drank Coke and talked about their families in a language he could not understand, but whose emotional content was unmistakable. The American guards had been instructed to maintain professional distance while adhering to humane standards. But regulations could not entirely prevent human connection. Shared cigarettes, laughter over a botched attempt at English or Japanese, a guard showing photographs of his family back home. Small moments of recognition that underneath the uniforms and the ideologies, men were just men. And then there was the food. Still recalled with immense gratitude by years of interviewees, how generous American food rations were for POWs. Baseball did come later, but hamburgers, Coca-Cola, often were the initial impressions of American largesse. In the context of insufficient Japanese supplies, the very act of feeding prisoners well was a mighty form of propaganda. The cultural analysis programs implemented by the U.S. military sought to systematically study Japanese psychology, values, and beliefs. Anthropologists, linguists, and military intelligence officers conducted extensive interviews with prisoners, trying to understand what made Japanese soldiers fight so fanatically, what beliefs drove their apparent disregard for death. The insights gained informed everything from tactical decisions to leaflet designs to post-war occupation plans. But these programs also exposed American personnel to the humanity of their enemies. Listening to a prisoner describe his childhood in rural Japan, his family's farm, his hopes before the war, it became difficult to maintain the cartoon villainy that propaganda demanded.
The medical care provided in the camps reinforced these revelations. Prisoners who arrived wounded or sick received treatment from American military doctors and nurses. Penicillin, that miracle drug that would save countless lives during and after the war, was administered even to enemy soldiers. Dental care, eyeglasses, surgical procedures, all were provided according to the same standards applied to American personnel. Some prisoners had never seen a dentist before their capture. The concept of preventative medicine, of treating illness before it became life-threatening, was foreign to men from rural backgrounds where a doctor was an unaffordable luxury. One prisoner, a farmer's son from Hokkaido, later wrote about his astonishment when an American dentist filled a cavity that had been causing him pain for years. He had assumed the pain was simply something to endure, a fact of life like cold winters or hard labor. But the Americans treated it as a problem to be solved. They numbed his mouth with an injection, drilled out the decay, filled the hole with amalgam. When it was done, the pain was gone. Such a small thing, perhaps, but to him it represented a fundamental difference in worldview. Americans seemed to believe that suffering could be reduced, that problems had solutions, that life could be improved through science and effort. The libraries and educational programs in the camps offered another form of nourishment, one that proved equally transformative for some prisoners. Books in Japanese, carefully selected by intelligence officers to present alternative perspectives on history and politics, were made available. English language classes were offered for those interested. Films were shown, not just entertainment, but newsreels and documentaries designed to demonstrate American industrial capacity and democratic values. Some prisoners dismissed all of this as propaganda, and of course it was. But propaganda based on facts is harder to dismiss than propaganda based on lies. One film that made a particular impression showed American factories producing war materiel. The prisoners watched assembly lines churning out tanks, ships, aircraft at a rate that seemed impossible. They saw workers, men and women, white and black, working side by side, creating the machinery of war with casual efficiency. The implicit message was clear. Japan could never win this war. The productive capacity of the United States was simply too vast. But for the prisoners watching, there was a secondary realization. These factory workers looked healthy, well-fed. They wore decent clothes, worked in clean facilities, seemed to labor without the brutal discipline that characterized Japanese factories. Even American workers, even in wartime, enjoyed a standard of living that seemed enviable. The presence of women in the workforce particularly struck the prisoners. In Japan, women's roles were rigidly defined and circumscribed. The idea of women welding ship hulls or riveting aircraft fuselages seemed to violate natural order. Yet here was evidence that American women could and did perform such work, contributing directly to the war effort. Some prisoners found this shocking, even offensive. Others saw it as a revelation of wasted potential. If women could build ships, what else might they accomplish if given opportunity? As 1945 dawned and the war entered its final, brutal phase, the prisoners in American camps found themselves in an increasingly strange position. They were safe, comfortable, well-fed, while their countrymen back home faced apocalyptic destruction. The firebombing of Tokyo in March killed more than 100,000 people in a single night. Similar raids devastated other major cities. American submarines had effectively ended Japanese maritime commerce, starving the home islands of food, fuel, and raw materials. And through it all, the prisoners in America continued to receive their 3 meals a day, their occasional Coca-Colas, their opportunities to play baseball and attend English classes and watch movies. The guilt was crushing for some. How could they enjoy hamburgers while their families starved? How could they drink Coca-Cola while their cities burned? The shame of survival, already immense, became almost unbearable when combined with the knowledge that survival meant comparative luxury. Some prisoners attempted to refuse food in solidarity with their suffering compatriots. But hunger is a powerful force, and most could not maintain such gestures for long. The body demands sustenance regardless of what the mind believes about honor. Others tried to find meaning in their circumstances. Perhaps, they reasoned, they were learning valuable information that could help Japan after the war. Perhaps understanding America, its people, its systems, its strengths and weaknesses, would prove useful in whatever future awaited. This rationalization allowed them to engage with their captors without feeling like collaborators, to accept the food and education and medical care as intelligence gathering rather than betrayal. And then came August. The atomic bombs, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the emperor's radio address announcing surrender, his voice thin and reedy, speaking in classical Japanese that many ordinary citizens struggled to understand, but whose meaning was unmistakable. Japan had lost. The war was over. When news of the surrender reached the camps, reactions varied wildly. Some prisoners wept openly, their entire worldview collapsing in an instant. Others maintained stoic silence, refusing to accept what their ears had heard. A handful attempted suicide, unable to bear the shame of their nation's capitulation. But many, perhaps most, felt something unexpected: relief. The war was over. They had survived. Whatever awaited them back home, at least the dying had stopped. The question of what would happen to them now became urgent. Would they be repatriated? When? Under what conditions? Would they face punishment for having been captured? Would their families acknowledge them or treat them as ghosts, officially dead and therefore socially non-existent? The answers came slowly, filtered through military bureaucracy and the chaos of post-war adjustment. In the months following surrender, as the American occupation of Japan began and the world started the long process of counting its dead and rebuilding, the prisoners in American camps existed in a strange limbo. They were no longer enemy combatants, but not yet free men. They attended lectures about democracy and watched films about American life. They worked their assigned jobs and earned their camp script and bought their Coca-Colas from the canteen. And they waited. Most Japanese POWs in American custody would eventually return to Japan in late 1945 and 1946. They would board ships and cross the Pacific in reverse, carrying with them duffel bags of belongings and heads full of memories that defied simple categorization. The journey home was often marked with anxiety and anticipation in equal measure. What would they find? What would their families say? How would a defeated Japan receive soldiers who had survived capture, who had lived comfortably while the homeland burned? The reality many encountered was complex and often painful. Some families welcomed them with quiet relief, grateful to have their sons or husbands back alive. Others struggled with the shame, treating the returning prisoners with coldness or open hostility. The official narrative of Japan's defeat emphasized suffering and sacrifice, and men who had been well-fed in American camps did not fit that narrative comfortably. Some prisoners chose to minimize or conceal their experiences, inventing stories of hardship that better matched expectations. But others, particularly as years passed and the immediate trauma of defeat began to fade, started to share their true experiences. They spoke carefully at first, testing whether audiences were ready to hear about hamburgers and Coca-Cola, about friendly guards and baseball games, about being treated with basic human decency by the very enemies they had been taught to regard as subhuman monsters.
What do you tell people when you return? How do you describe a captivity where you gained weight instead of losing it, where your captors gave you ice cream and let you play baseball, where the greatest cultural shock was not cruelty, but kindness? How do you reconcile the propaganda portrait of demonic Americans with the reality of guards who showed you photographs of their children and laughed at your jokes? For some returning prisoners, the answer was silence. They recognized that their experiences did not fit the narratives that post-war Japan needed to construct. The country was engaged in a massive collective effort to make sense of catastrophic defeat, to find meaning in the rubble of bombed cities and the ashes of the dead. Stories about comfortable captivity in American camps, about tasting Coca-Cola and learning about democracy, seemed almost indecent in the face of such widespread suffering. Others shared their stories cautiously with family and close friends, acknowledging that American captivity had been unexpectedly bearable. They described the food, the medical care, the educational programs, careful to note that they had never abandoned their loyalty to Japan, that they had simply tried to survive as best they could under difficult circumstances. Some framed their experiences as reconnaissance, claiming they had studied the Americans carefully to understand the enemy better. This allowed them to discuss what they had learned without seeming like they had been seduced by American propaganda. A very few became advocates for reconciliation, arguing that the Americans they had met were not devils but ordinary people, and that perhaps the same was true in reverse, that the demonization had been mutual and equally false. These men often faced criticism and suspicion from their neighbors. Japan in the late 1940s was not ready for such generous interpretations of the recent enemy. There were too many graves, too much destruction, too much pain. Forgiveness would come later, if at all. The hamburgers and Coca-Cola they had consumed became, in memory, something more than food and drink. They became symbols of an alternative reality, proof that the world was larger and stranger than they had been taught. For men who had grown up under the rising sun, even the taste of sugar was a reminder that the world they thought they understood was gone forever, replaced by something they were only beginning to comprehend. In the broader sweep of history, these experiences contributed to something remarkable: the relatively smooth American occupation of Japan and the subsequent transformation of bitter enemies into close allies. The groundwork was laid in part by those thousands of small interactions, those moments when prejudice encountered contrary evidence and began to crack. American occupation personnel who had worked with Japanese POWs brought understanding and sometimes even affection for Japanese culture. They had learned that Japanese soldiers were not fanatical robots, but human beings, capable of adaptation and change. This knowledge informed occupation policies that, while certainly serving American interests, also showed unusual sensitivity to Japanese concerns. Meanwhile, Japanese who had experienced American captivity became informal ambassadors, explaining to their compatriots that Americans were not the monsters of wartime propaganda. They described the food, the medical care, the basic decency of treatment. They helped demystify the occupiers, making them seem less alien and threatening. This was not forgiveness. Forgiveness would take much longer and would remain incomplete, but it was a first step toward mutual comprehension. The symbolism of food in this transformation cannot be overstated. When the occupation began, American forces distributed food aid to a starving Japanese population: chocolate bars, canned meat, powdered milk, flour for bread. These items saved lives and demonstrated that America intended to rebuild rather than punish. The generosity was strategic, certainly, but it was also genuine. And for many Japanese civilians receiving these provisions, the abundance recalled stories they might have heard from returned POWs about the inexhaustible plenty of America.
And among these release supplies, inevitably, there was Coca-Cola. The company, with remarkable foresight and aggressive business acumen, had followed American troops throughout the war, establishing bottling facilities near military bases and combat zones. The goal was to ensure that American servicemen could access their favorite beverage no matter where they served. Now those same systems provided familiar refreshment to occupation soldiers while introducing Japanese civilians to the beverage that some former POWs already knew. For those former prisoners, seeing Coca-Cola bottles appearing in Japanese shops and restaurants must have provoked complex emotions. The drink that had once symbolized their captivity, that had represented everything alien and American about their experience, was now becoming part of daily Japanese life. The beverage that had shocked their palates in mess halls from Wisconsin to Texas was now being sold to their countrymen, advertised in Japanese, incorporated into a culture that was rapidly transforming under occupation guidance. The hamburger took longer to penetrate Japanese culture, but it too would eventually arrive. As Japan rebuilt under American guidance, adopting democratic institutions and capitalist economics, American consumer culture followed. Fast food restaurants would not appear in significant numbers until the 1970s, but when they did, they would find a receptive audience. By then, a new generation of Japanese would have grown up with access to Western foods, thinking nothing remarkable about them. The cultural gap that had seemed so vast in 1943 had narrowed to a manageable distance. But for those who had crossed that gap as prisoners, the memory remained vivid. In interviews conducted decades after the war, elderly former POWs would sometimes recall their first taste of American food with surprising clarity. The shock of abundance, the confusion and eventual adaptation, the slow recognition that their enemies were human beings who valued many of the same things they did: family, peace, simple pleasures. These memories were often tinged with complex emotions: gratitude for humane treatment, mixed with sorrow for lost years and fallen comrades; curiosity about the American guards they had known, with lingering patriotic discomfort at having survived while others died. One former prisoner, interviewed in the 1990s by a Japanese television crew documenting wartime experiences, described his first Coca-Cola with the wonder of someone recalling a transformative moment. He had expected it to be terrible, he said, this strange American drink that looked like medicine or ink. He had drunk it defiantly, determined not to show weakness by refusing what was offered. But the cold sweetness had surprised him, and against his will he had enjoyed it. That small pleasure, he suggested, had been the beginning of a larger revelation, that enjoying something American did not make him less Japanese, that the war's divisions had been artificial, constructed by politicians and generals who had never tasted what the other side offered. Another veteran recalled his first hamburger with similar vividness. He had been baffled by it initially: bread and meat together, eaten with hands rather than chopsticks, garnished with raw vegetables and mysterious sauces. It had seemed barbaric, uncivilized, exactly what one would expect from Americans. But he was hungry, and he had eaten it. And to his surprise, it had been delicious. The meat was seasoned and cooked well, the vegetables were fresh, the bread was soft and substantial. It was a complete meal in his hands, requiring no elaborate preparation or ceremony. Months later, he found himself looking forward to hamburgers, even requesting them when given a choice. He felt guilty about this preference, worried that meant he was betraying his culture. But the hamburgers kept coming, and he kept eating them.
Such reflections might seem naive or oversimplified to those who did not live through those experiences. Certainly, food and drink alone did not erase the terrible violence of the Pacific War or heal its wounds. The reconciliation between Japan and America was a complex process involving political calculation, economic interest, strategic necessity, and the gradual passage of time that allows old hatreds to fade. Individual experiences varied enormously. Some former POWs remained bitter about their capture and treatment, despite its relative humanity. Some Americans remained hateful toward all things Japanese for the rest of their lives. The path from war to peace is never as simple as sharing a meal. But neither can we dismiss the power of those small moments. Human understanding is built incrementally through countless tiny interactions that gradually accumulate into changed perspectives. When a Japanese soldier tasted a hamburger and found the good, when he drank Coca-Cola and recognized that as a small luxury rather than a poison, when he laughed with an American guard over some shared joke, these moments mattered. They did not end the war. They did not prevent the atomic bombs or erase the atrocities committed by both sides. But they planted seeds of recognition that would later blossom into something like mutual respect, something approaching friendship between former enemies. The story of Japanese POWs and American food is ultimately a story about the limits of propaganda and the resilience of human connection. Governments can declare enemies. They can create elaborate mythologies about why those enemies deserve hatred. They can train young men to kill without mercy and to die without hesitation. They can produce films and posters and radio broadcasts that portray the other side as inhuman monsters. But they cannot completely prevent people from recognizing their common humanity when circumstances force them into proximity and daily interaction. Food, because it is so fundamental to survival, so laden with cultural meaning, yet so universally necessary, became the medium through which this recognition occurred. A man must eat regardless of ideology, and when he eats, he cannot help but notice what he is eating, how it tastes, how it makes him feel, what it suggests about the people who provided it. If what he tastes contradicts everything he has been told, if the abundance he encounters renders his beliefs about his enemies implausible, if the simple act of eating becomes evidence against the propaganda he has internalized, then something shifts, however slightly, in his understanding of the world. The hamburger was not just a sandwich. The Coca-Cola was not just a beverage. They were artifacts of a civilization, carrying within them information about values, priorities, and possibilities. To a Japanese soldier raised in scarcity and hierarchy, these American foods communicated messages that no speech or pamphlet could match. Here is a society wealthy enough to feed its enemies, egalitarian enough to share the same food across social ranks, confident enough in its values to expose prisoners to its way of life without fear that such exposure would strengthen enemy resolve. And they were right not to fear. Exposure to American abundance did not create revolutionaries or traitors among the Japanese POWs, but it did create doubt. It created questions. It created a kind of cognitive flexibility that made post-war reconciliation possible. When the emperor announced surrender and urged his people to endure the unendurable, those who had already endured American captivity discovered that the unendurable was in fact quite bearable. The occupation they had dreaded became an opportunity. The defeat they had feared became a chance for renewal. The realization came gradually for most. In the camps, surrounded by barbed wire, but well-fed and relatively comfortable, the prisoners had time to think, time to reflect on what they had been taught versus what they were experiencing, time to compare the propaganda about American barbarity with the actual behavior of their captors. Time to wonder why, if Japan was truly superior in spirit and virtue, it had lost so catastrophically to a nation supposedly weakened by materialism and self-indulgence. These were dangerous thoughts. To think them was to question everything. The emperor's divine status, the righteousness of Japan's war aims, the wisdom of military leadership, the validity of traditional values that had governed Japanese society for centuries. Some prisoners shut down such thoughts immediately, clinging to old certainties as protection against psychological disillusion. But others let the questions surface, turned them over in their minds during long work shifts or sleepless nights, and found that once questioned, the old certainties could not be fully restored. The camp newspapers, produced by prisoners under American supervision, became another vehicle for this gradual transformation. These publications, printed in Japanese, contained the mix of news from the war, features about American life and values, and contributions from prisoners themselves, poetry, essays, artwork. Reading them, prisoners could encounter ideas that would have been forbidden in Japanese Imperial Japan: democracy, individual rights, the peaceful resolution of disputes, the value of dissent and debate. These concepts were presented not as abstract theories, but as lived realities, aspects of American life that explained the nation's strength and prosperity. Some prisoners contributed their own writings to these newspapers,
often poetry that expressed their confused feelings about captivity, defeat, and exposure to foreign ideas. Traditional Japanese poet forms, haiku, tanka, were employed to process profoundly disorienting experiences. A haiku about the taste of Coca-Cola, a tanka about watching American guards play with their children during family visiting hours. Through poetry, prisoners could express ambivalence and complexity that direct prose might have made seem like disloyalty.
The religious dimension of camp life also contributed to transformation. Christian chaplains were available to prisoners who wished to speak with them, and some prisoners, finding their traditional belief systems shaken by defeat and captivity, sought answers in Christianity. The missionaries who had been expelled from Japan in the 1930s and 40s had portrayed Christianity as compatible with Japanese culture, as a universal faith that transcended national boundaries. Now, in American camps, a few prisoners encountered these ideas again and found them newly relevant. Buddhism, too, played a role. Some camps allowed Buddhist priests among the prisoners to conduct services and offer spiritual guidance. These priests faced their own crises of meaning. How to counsel men who felt abandoned by the gods, who questioned whether their suffering had any purpose. Some priests offered traditional answers about karma and the importance of accepting one's fate. Others engaged more deeply with the questions, acknowledging that defeat challenged simplistic understandings of divine favor and national destiny. As 1946 progressed and repatriation ships began carrying prisoners back to Japan, the camps slowly emptied. The men who had spent years behind American barbed wire gathered their belongings, said goodbye to guards they had come to know, and prepared for uncertain homecomings. Some had received letters from family members, brief messages heavily censored but confirming that loved ones had survived the war. Others had heard nothing and feared the worst. The voyage across the Pacific was a time of reflection and anxiety. The ships were crowded, the accommodations basic, but compared to the hell ships that had transported Allied POWs under Japanese custody, these were luxury cruises. The prisoners were fed adequately, allowed on deck for fresh air and exercise, and treated with basic decency. As the coastline of Japan came into view, emotions overwhelmed many. Some wept with joy at seeing their homeland again. Others wept with dread at what they might find. The Japan they returned to was a nation in ruins and transformation. Cities were devastated, populations were displaced and starving, the economy had collapsed, and American occupation forces were implementing sweeping reforms. The emperor had renounced his divinity, women had been granted the right to vote, labor unions were being encouraged, land reform was redistributing property. The entire social and political structure that had governed Japanese life was being dismantled and rebuilt according to American democratic principles. For returning POWs, this transformed landscape was both familiar and alien. They had left Imperial Japan at its height of militaristic fervor. They returned to a defeated nation that was being systematically remade in the image of its conqueror. Some found this deeply disturbing, a final humiliation added to the shame of capture and defeat. Others, particularly those who had experienced the cognitive shifts that life in American camps could produce, saw it as perhaps necessary, even hopeful. The returning prisoners brought with them not just memories, but skills and knowledge. Some had learned English to a functional level. Others had acquired technical skills through their work assignments in the camps. A few had absorbed democratic ideas and values that would prove useful as Japan constructed new political institutions. They became, often quietly and without recognition, part of the human infrastructure of post-war reconciliation. In the decades that followed, Japan would transform with remarkable speed from defeated enemy to close ally of the United States. The causes were multiple and complex: Cold War strategic considerations, enlightened occupation policies, Japanese cultural adaptability, economic opportunities, and more. But among those causes, small and often overlooked, were the thousands of personal connections formed during the war, including those between Japanese POWs and their American captors. The former prisoners grew older.
They married or reunited with wives, had children, rebuilt lives in a nation that itself was being rebuilt. They pursued careers in the new democratic Japan, often prospering as the economy began its miraculous recovery in the 1950s and 60s. And sometimes, in quiet moments, they remembered their time in American camps. The fear that had gradually given way to bewilderment, then to adaptation, and finally to a grudging appreciation for the decency of their treatment. They remembered the hamburgers, that strange, abundant food that had seemed so foreign and had become so familiar. They remembered the Coca-Cola, the sweet, fizzy drink that had shocked their palates and had become a daily pleasure. They remembered ice cream melting on their tongues during Texas summers, bread softer than any they had known in Japan, coffee strong and bitter, and somehow comforting. They remembered baseball games and English classes, and guards who had treated them like human beings rather than animals or devils. And as Japan itself embraced American consumer culture, as McDonald's and Coca-Cola came to Japan in the decades after the war and became part of ordinary Japanese life, these former prisoners must have experienced a peculiar sense of vindication. The foods that had once seemed so alien, so representative of enemy culture, had been absorbed into Japanese daily life. Their countrymen now consumed hamburgers and Coca-Cola without seeing them as American or foreign. They were simply food and drink, options among many in an increasingly globalized world. The story comes full circle. The prisoners who had tasted these foods behind barbed wire, who had found them strange and overwhelming and eventually appealing, lived to see their children and grandchildren consuming them casually, thoughtlessly, as normal parts of modern life. The cultural distance that had seemed unbridgeable in 1943 had been bridged so thoroughly that young Japanese in the 1980s or 90s could hardly imagine a time when hamburgers and Coca-Cola were exotic foreign imports rather than familiar conveniences. But history remembers, even when individuals forget. In the archives, in the recorded testimonies, in the fading memories of elderly men who once crossed an ocean as enemies and returned as something more complicated, the story persists. It reminds us that wars are fought by individuals who remain capable of change, of learning, of recognizing when they have been deceived. It demonstrates that soft power, the power of culture, of kindness, of small daily courtesies, can achieve what hard power alone cannot. The Japanese prisoners who tasted Coca-Cola and hamburgers in American camps during World War II participated in an experiment neither side fully understood at the time. They were test cases for whether humanizing the enemy might ultimately serve strategic goals better than demonizing them. The results, while not conclusive in any scientific sense, were suggestive. Treating prisoners with basic decency did not weaken American resolve or military effectiveness. Exposing them to American abundance did not strengthen their commitment to fight. Instead, it laid groundwork for a post-war relationship that would prove far more valuable than whatever marginal military advantage might have been gained through cruelty. This is not to romanticize or excuse the complexities and moral ambiguities of war. American treatment of Japanese Americans during the same period remains a deep stain on the nation's history, a reminder that even democracies can succumb to racism and fear. The decision to use atomic weapons remains morally complex and historically debated, a choice that saved American lives but incinerated Japanese civilians in numbers that still shock the conscience. War is never clean, never purely noble or ignoble, never reducible to simple narratives of good versus evil. But within the moral ambiguity, certain clear points emerge. The choice to follow Geneva Convention guidelines, to feed prisoners adequately, to provide medical care, to allow basic dignity. These choices had consequences that extended far beyond the camps themselves. They demonstrated that America, despite the racism and brutality that had characterized much of the Pacific War, was still committed to certain universal principles. They suggested that democratic values included extending basic human rights even to enemies. They proved that showing mercy was not weakness but could be a form of strength. For the men who lived through it, the memory of that time remained indelible. They had expected hell and found something else. Not paradise, certainly. They were still prisoners, still separated from homes and families, still bearing the shame that Japanese culture attached to surrender. But they found a kind of purgatory where suffering was limited, where small pleasures were possible, where the enemy wore a human face and sometimes showed unexpected kindness. And sometimes, in the Texas heat or the Wisconsin cold, they found themselves standing in a mess hall line, tray in hand, accepting a hamburger from a guard who might have killed them on some Pacific island, but who here, in this strange interlude, simply served them food. And they found themselves drinking Coca-Cola from those distinctively curved bottles, the liquid cold and sweet and wholly American, and recognizing that they were tasting the future, that the world after the war would be shaped by this abundance, this confidence, this strange democracy of appetite that made no distinction between victor and vanquished at the dinner table. The taste lingered long after the bottles were empty and the plates were clean. It lingered through the years of occupation and reconstruction. It lingered as Japan rebuilt and reinvented itself, transforming from militaristic empire to peaceful democracy, from isolated island nation to integral part of the global economy. It lingered in the memories of old men who told their grandchildren about a war that seemed increasingly remote, increasingly impossible to explain. But they tried to explain anyway. These old men with their fading memories and their complex emotions. They tried to describe what it meant to discover that the enemy was not what they had expected, that cruelty could give way to kindness, that even in captivity there could be small moments of grace. They tried to convey the profound disorientation of finding abundance where they had expected privation, finding humanity where they had expected brutality, finding questions where they had expected only answers. For men who had grown up under the rising sun, even the taste of sugar was a reminder that the world they thought they understood was gone, replaced by something stranger and more complex. The Hamburgers and Coca-Cola had not caused the war to end. They had not rewritten history or erased wounds, but they had opened a door, just a crack, through which light could enter. And sometimes that is enough. Sometimes the most powerful weapons are not bombs or bullets, but ideas, kindness, and the simple taste of freedom, served cold in a glass bottle or hot between two pieces of bread, offered without malice to men who had expected only death, and who found instead a glimpse of another way to live, a way that valued abundance over scarcity, equality over hierarchy, individual dignity over collective subjugation, a way that suggested that former enemies might become friends, that nations might reconcile, that the future need not replicate the past. The prisoners who crossed the Pacific in chains and returned with these memories became witnesses to a larger truth, that human connection is stronger than political division, that daily kindness can overcome abstract hatred, that sharing a meal can be the first step towards understanding. They learned, against their will and against their training, that the Americans they had been taught to despise were simply people, flawed, certainly, but no more monstrous than themselves. And perhaps most importantly, they learned that they themselves could change, that the beliefs they had held most deeply could be questioned and revised, that loyalty to one's country did not require hating its enemies, that honor could survive defeat, that dignity could persist in captivity, that a man could remain essentially himself while adapting to circumstances that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. These lessons, learned one hamburger and one Coca-Cola at a time, rippled outward through the decades that followed. They informed the occupation, they shaped the rebuilding, they contributed to the alliance, they helped transform the Pacific from a theater of war to a region of peace and prosperity. Not alone, certainly. History is never that simple, but their contribution was real, measurable in the choices made by individuals who had learned that the other was not so different after all. And so the story of Japanese POWs and American food becomes finally a story of hope. Not naive hope that ignores the terrible costs of war or pretends that reconciliation is easy or complete, but realistic hope that recognizes human capacity for growth, for change, for moving beyond the hatreds that seem so justified and so permanent in the moment. Hope that a soldier who expected to die could instead learn to live.
Hope that enemies could become, if not friends, then at least no longer enemies. Hope that the taste of a hamburger or a sip of Coca-Cola could plant seeds that would flower decades later into peace.